Hello and welcome to the lecture for Book 3 of the Republic. And now we're really getting into some of the really key questions of the text. And in this chapter, we're going to see Plato's reckoning with the elements of Greek culture, of Athenian culture that came before him, the Homeric epics. We're also going to hear about his views, his not very positive views on tragedy and comedy and their role in the state, and why he's opposed to the kind of exercise of emotion and the raising of emotional state that is found in tragedy in particular. And so there's a reckoning here with art. Plato has a very famously negative idea of the role of art in the city and what it can do. And we'll see later in the course that Aristotle actually has a very different view when we look at his view of tragedy. But certainly for Plato, there's a very, very limited role for the arts, and that's simply as kind of supporting forms of virtue. And he's very he definitely pushes a sort of robust idea of censorship, of state censorship here in this chapter. And so we'll get through that, and we'll see some interesting things that happen towards the end of the chapter as well that set up the all-important argument of Book 4 that we'll get to next time. So in this book, Book 3, Plato is going to continue to focus on the education of the guardians. And in fact, by the end of this book, we'll see the major classes in the Republic will be kind of separated out. And we'll get a class of rulers, the true so-called true guardians, who will be separated out from the guardians as a whole. And that class will become the class of auxiliaries or warriors. So they are guardians in the sense of preserving the city. And there's a small subset of that class who become the rulers, the true guardians, who are going to be the class that rules. And of course, we're going to learn what kinds of art and artistic performance are unacceptable in the just city. And that category, as we'll see, comes to encompass quite a lot. And it encompasses a lot of what for the Athenians would have been their treasured stories and their the sort of performances and culture and theatre that they would have been proud of. So Plato's really cutting deeply into Athenian culture and kind of deciding what's acceptable in the ideal state and what's not. So the first thing we come across in this chapter is this discussion of how in poetry there's this softening of the emotions, the fact that people are made to fear death. And he uses Homer and the story of Achilles to make this point about the underworld as a fearful place. And it's as though it leaves people with no motivation. It softens the emotions. It sort of takes away, Plato is saying, it takes away our sort of determination. It takes away our motivation to act. It sort of softens the emotions. So this idea that certain forms of poetic presentation and when it enhances or it sort of calls out our emotions in certain ways that make us fearful, and that can inhibit our capacity to act. And that's what Plato is sort of really concerned with here, that it's this sort of softening of emotions that makes us unable to deal with threatening circumstances, makes us unable to sort of deal with circumstances that require kind of determined action to get through. So it kind of softens us. He also mentions things like excessive laughter, the times when we're sort of when we're kind of brought out of ourselves by laughter and we lose control. And that idea of the loss of self-control is really crucial, I think, for understanding what Plato's getting at here. It's that idea of us, of our emotions sort of getting into a heightened state that makes us lose that sense of self-control that Plato really fears, that it's the emotions that are going to be sort of making decisions in their heightened state, or at least they're going to neutralize our ability to think clearly and act according to reason. So it's the emotions in this heightened state that are a problem. So Plato wants to lessen those influences, and in fact wants to censor those influences that cause people to fear death. And of course the point of that is that the fear of death becomes paralyzing when it becomes an all-encompassing fear, and it hinders people's ability to think clearly and to act successfully. Now, here, and we'll get to the significance of this a little later on, but Plato here tells us about the obligation to tell the truth. And he says, further truth, and here it's of course Socrates who is speaking, further truth must be taken seriously too, for if what we were just saying was correct and a lie is really useless to gods and useful to human beings as a form of remedy, it's plain that anything of the sort must be assigned to doctors, while private men must not put their hands to it. Yes, he said, it's plain. Then it's appropriate for the rulers, if for anyone at all, to lie for the benefit of the city in cases involving enemies or citizens, while all the rest must not put their hands to anything of the sort. We'll say that for a private man to lie to such rulers is a fault the same as and even greater than for a sick man or a man in training not to tell the truth about the affections of his body to the doctor or the trainer, or for a man not to say to the pilot the things that are concerning the ship and the sailors, lying about how he himself or his fellow sailors are faring. Very true, he said. Okay, so you can get an idea here of how this is going. It's like there's an obligation to tell the truth, but there's a kind of get out here for people in positions of authority. We're told that it's appropriate for rulers, if anyone, to lie for the benefit of the city, and this is then extended to other authority figures like doctors, who sort of may have a reason in the terms of whatever they're proposing as a remedy to decide what it's useful to tell a patient. So there's a kind of reversal here, that it's an unbreakable obligation to tell the truth for people who are interrogated by authority, but that obligation does not hold in the reverse case. Excuse me, it's appropriate for the rulers, if for anyone at all, to lie for the benefit of the city, Plato says, which suggests that there's a non-reciprocity here between the rulers and the ruled, that it may be that there's a truth that the rulers are entitled to hold back and not tell the citizens possibly for the greater benefit of the city, but it can never be the sort of moral right of the citizens to withhold truth from the rulers. So this sort of the obligation to tell the truth is very much here a one-way street. It doesn't appear to hold for the rulers, and that exception may be sort of extended, but certainly for the rulers, if they judge that it's for the greater good, this opens the possibility of not telling the truth. So this is quite, and Plato's seems to be quite clear about this obligation and the fact that it is a one-way street. And as we'll see, this comes out at the end of the chapter when he tells us what things must be told to citizens in order to fan the city. Okay, now one of Plato's criticisms of art and poetry in this chapter is the idea of imitation, is based on this idea of imitation, or in in Greek, what's mimesis or mimesis. So coming from the word mime, which is sort of linked to our word imitation and copying and so on. So Plato makes a couple of points, or has Socrates make a couple of points here about imitation. Firstly, that it conflicts with the principle of one man, one job that has been established for the city. Everybody is to do one thing and be good at one thing. And of course, the point here is that in theatre, people imitate other people, right? That if the role requires you to be a police officer, a janitor, a teacher, you have to mimic that person. So it's and this is in line with Plato's general theory of art, that it's a form of copying that doesn't really understand what it's copying. And this can be seen in this idea of mimesis, that actors on the stage are taking up parts that they don't really understand. They're just kind of miming or copying what they look like. And this is reflected in this idea that it conflicts with one man, one job. You can only be good at one thing if you're imitating a number of things. You're probably not going to be good at any of them. And the second point he makes is that it is wrong to imitate shameful things, and the young should only imitate good and healthy things. So that's going to, change the character of a lot of theatre, and a lot of ancient theatre would have been, for Plato, would have fallen foul of this prescription, that you can't show people wailing, you can't show people losing control of themselves. You can only, and of course you can't show the kind of acts that bring about people losing control of themselves. So everything has to be about good and healthy examples. So there's very sort of severe restrictions on what can be imitated. So in this chapter, we get a view of education as the inculcation of healthy habits and patterns of thought. So it's establishing in the young these healthy habits and these patterns of thought that are going to sort of stand them instead for a sort of lifetime of successful habits. And Plato says on the section 409, a judge, on the other hand, rules a soul with a soul, and it's not possible for it to have been reared and been familiar with bad souls from youth on, and to have gone through the list of all unjust deeds, and to have committed them itself, so as to be sharp at inferring from itself the unjust deeds of others, like diseases in the body. Rather, it must have been inexperienced and untainted by bad dispositions when it was young, if, as a fine and good soul, it's going to make healthy judgments about what is just. This is exactly why decent men, when they are young, look as though they were innocents, and easily deceived by unjust men, because they have in themselves no patterns of affections similar to those of bad men. So just listen to how important healthy habits are in that sort of that understanding and that scenario, that it's all about the kind of habits that you take on and that become normal, right? So if you're habituated into these varieties of injustice and sort of committing unjust deeds, you know a lot about these patterns, but that's not healthy. What you need is to be sort of reared in a way that you're innocent of those patterns. And of course, the implication here that Socrates spells out is that people who are sort of brought up in this way with healthy habits are going to look like innocents, and they're going to look like they're easy prey for people who have been reared otherwise, right? Because they just don't understand the stakes. They don't understand what unjust men are trying to do and why they behave that way, because they just don't have these patterns of affection. So it looks like they're easy prey, they're innocents. But that's the way for Socrates here, that's the way it should be, right? This is how things are supposed to be if we're going to be raised in a way that gives us a chance of developing the right habits, right thoughts and the right virtues. Now, when we talk about the actual education of the young here, Plato talks in terms of these two things, music and gymnastic. And it makes sense to sort of think of one of them as a training of the soul or the mind, and the other one, gymnastic, is sort of heavily focused on the body. Except that the way that Plato describes them, that's not really what seems to be going on. That there is some bodily training, but it's actually it's the real effects that it, or the positive effects that it gives us, are not really about the body. They're about the soul. They're about how it toughens up our mind. And this passage on page 90 really summarizes that. Socrates says, "Now I for one would assert that some god gave two arts to human beings for these two things, as it seems, music and gymnastic for the spirited and the philosophic, not for soul and body," right? So it's not for the education of soul and the body, except incidentally, but rather for these two. In other words, for the spirited and the philosophic. He did so in order that they might be harmonized with one another by being tuned to the proper degree of tension and relaxation. So what's really going on with music and gymnastic is the kind of tuning, the respective tuning and harmonizing of the spirited part of our soul and the philosophic part of our soul. Now, we'll go into these in more detail in the next chapter, but that sort of spiritedness is our sense of anger, our sense of pride, our sense of self-esteem that gets sort of raised and and pushes us into a rage. So that's our kind of spiritedness, our sort of social sense and our sense of social standing. And the philosophic for Plato is our thinking component and our reasoning component, which is supposed to know the good and is supposed to be in charge and to make decisions. So it's these two that are being kind of harmonized. Music is sort of taming the spirit. Gymnastic is hardening the philosophic to make it resistant and to make it strong enough to resist the sort of strong affects of the other parts of the soul. So music softens the spiritedness of the warrior. And remember, we're talking here about the education of the guardians still, and we know that the part of the role of the guardians is to protect the city. Music softens their spiritedness, relaxing the urge to rage and the rush to anger. And we know that these, remember, Polemicus called them noble dogs, these sort of guardian dogs. We know that they're supposed to be sort of soft and gentle with citizens, and hard with outsiders. So they need to be able to be able to soften. They need to be able to recognize as sort of contrary to that anger and that hardness. And music kind of softens the spirited part of the soul, making it slower to raise its hackles, making it slower to anger. Gymnastic, in contrast, hardens the philosophic part of our nature, and of course that's going to be the ruling part, as we'll see. It strengthens it so it can resist desires and angers that threaten to overcome us, that threaten to take charge and make us do things that we will later regret, right? So it's strengthening the philosophic part so that it will be able to resist the inducements that come from other parts of the soul. Now, in this chapter, moderation becomes one of the key elements in the organization of the city. As we'll see in Book 4, moderation is one of the central virtues of the just city, and Socrates will identify it there as well. Here it becomes key, and it's based on this idea of a city that's no longer based on the simplicity of need. And we've seen the city develop to the point where there's an array of entertainment and luxuries. Of course, now We're dealing with the point where we're considering things like theatre, our tragedy and comedy and poetry and all these kind of public performances. Are they going to be let into the city? And what about sort of luxuries and sort of other things than spices and sort of other things that are going to be let into the city? Things that stimulate and inflame desire and pride or spiritedness. So the education of the guardians is supposed to restore moderation and self-control. And that's really the point of music and gymnastic in this education of the young that Socrates is laying out. It restores the point that was kind of already there. Remember when we were dealing with the city of pigs, the simple city based on need. Once the city becomes more luxurious and desire is inflamed and pride is inflamed, citizens want to feel good about themselves and look good in the sight of others. So that creates these desires and urges that can get in the way of harmony and moderation. So moderation restores that balance and restores self-control to keep the city in balance and to keep the city in harmony. And Socrates, on page 67, explicitly identifies moderation with obedience and knowing one's place. He says, aren't these the most important elements of moderation for the multitude? Being obedient to the rulers and being themselves rulers of the pleasures of drink, sex, and eating. Right, so there's a kind of external obedience to others in the city in terms of how it's supposed to function. And then there's kind of obedience to oneself, where each of us ourselves is supposed to be rulers of our pleasures and to decide when to let those pleasures be exercised, when to let them get their satisfaction, and when not. So this idea of rule is a kind of all-encompassing thing for Plato, from the city and the sort of the organization of individuals, and then internally within individuals themselves reflect that same order of rule. And we'll spell that out more clearly, how each individual is really just the city in miniature. We'll spell out that argument in chapter 4, which we'll come to next. Okay, so returning to that, the idea of the theme of lie and truth, we come near the end of the chapter to the noble lie, and here Socrates makes the case that it is right for the rulers to tell these constitutive lies to citizens, and it's almost like these are the lies which found the city, right? These are like the founding myths, the things that citizens have to believe in their city. These are the things that sort of sustain the city itself. And we can sort of see the purpose if we look at them closely. There's two parts, where the first one is the autochthony myth. And this is a very familiar ancient myth. The idea that all citizens are born from the earth as brothers. So everybody sort of belongs together as sort of brothers. And of course that strengthens ties of solidarity between citizens. Everybody belongs together, everybody supports and protects each other, and it gives this sort of larger sense of everybody sort of sharing the same stakes, everybody being related, and everybody sort of looking out for each other. So it creates these strong bonds of solidarity that Socrates believes are necessary for the city to really prosper. The second part is a kind of justification for the functional differences, or the differences in classes that develop in the city. And again, like I said, we'll get more into that next week, next time when we look at book 4. So this is the natural hierarchy myth, the second myth that is part of the noble lie, and it tells citizens are made to believe that rulers have souls mixed with gold, auxiliaries have souls mixed with silver, and artisans have souls mixed with bronze, right? So this part of the myth naturalizes the difference, the hierarchy, the difference in class, the class differences between citizens. It naturalizes those differences by making it look like those differences are rooted in the sort of nature of individuals. Rulers are mixed with gold, auxiliaries with silver, and so on. So it kind of gives an ideological justification for the fact that people belong to different classes, right? Now, again, it's interesting that Plato felt that was necessary, that he felt that this kind of hierarchy myth was necessary in order for a city to function, that without this kind of support, that kind of class structure would not have the stability that it needed, and individuals maybe would not sort of believe in it in the same way. It certainly looks like that's a necessary sort of part of the city. So these two myths create this idea of solidarity, we're all in it together, but at the same time justify these sort of functional class differences that emerge in the city. Now, right at the end, we come upon this passage where Socrates kind of throws in, almost as an afterthought, this idea about how the guardians are to live, and the guardians we know now are made up of the rulers and the auxiliaries. So we've been talking about the education of the young and how they're going to be raised, and now we're going to focus even more on the education of the guardians, the rulers in particular, going forward. So here's what Socrates says right at the end of this chapter, and it's worth going through because it's going to be of central interest going forward. Well then, I said, so this is Socrates speaking, see if this is the way they must live and be housed if they're going to be such men, to be, in other words, the guardians. First, no one will possess any private property except for what's entirely necessary. Second, no one will have any house or storeroom into which everyone who wishes cannot come. The sustenance as much as is needed by moderate and courageous men who are champions of war, they'll receive in fixed instalments from the other citizens as a wage for their guarding, in such quantity that there will be no surplus for them in a year and no lack either. That they'll go regularly to mess together like soldiers in a camp and live a life in common. We'll tell them that gold and silver of a divine sort from the gods they have in their soul always, and have no further need of the human sort. Nor is it wholly to pollute the possession of the former sort by mixing it with the possession of the mortal sort, because many unholy things have been done for the sake of the currency of the many, while theirs is untainted. But for them alone, of those in the city, it is not lawful to handle and touch gold and silver, nor to go under the same roof with it, nor to hang it from their persons, nor to drink from silver or gold. Right? So the guardians are told another myth here, that they have gold and silver in them, and they have no need of the human sort. Right? So it's almost sort of developing a distinction here, again naturalizing the distinction between guardians and the rest of the citizens, the rest of the community, that suggests that there are kind of natural differences between them, excuse me, that sort of found these differences in how they act and the role they play in the city, which is quite striking. Again, it emphasizes the differences between the guardians and the rest of the citizens here, rather than minimizing those differences. And perhaps even more striking here, the idea that the guardians are to rule, but they're essentially to live in a very, shall we say, Spartan manner when they're doing so, right? They're not allowed to possess gold and silver. They're only given as much provisions, food and necessities that they need for the year. There's to be no surplus. They're not allowed to possess private property. They live in entirely these sort of common household arrangements, like they're in mess, like soldiers. They go to eat together. and they are very sort of, that they don't have anything in the way of private quarters. They don't possess any possessions. So this is quite a striking way of sort of making these guardians live, who of course are going to be looking out for the well-being of the city as a whole, right? And so that's going to be the crucial point here, that these guardians, these citizens, are going to be taxed with looking out for the city as a whole, not looking out for one part of it, or not seeking to enrich any part of it, but looking out for the well-being of the whole. So their task is an entirely communal and public function, right? So Socrates believes that as part of that function, it's important that they not be given any incentive or inducement to look after their private ends or their private desires. All of that is taken away as we see, right? So the guardians are effectively unable to do anything that goes against the public interest, because they don't have any private interest. So their private interest is taken away. And as we'll see, that's going to be intensified when we talk about family, and we'll see the guardians are not really allowed to have private families and so on. So it's a very it's a very Spartan arrangement, to use that term again, that we see with the guardians. And it's as though they are being educated and developed to be entirely public spirited citizens, with no sort of private needs, no private desires. And that may enable them to sort of act in a public spirited manner, but it might be the consequences of this might give us pause when we see what this actually means in terms of how they're going to live, in terms of how families are going to be arranged, and in terms of how the city as a whole is going to function. So this is a really crucial point, and the problems it sets up are going to be occupying us certainly for the next few books of the Republic. All right. So let's see if we can summarize some of the central things that emerged in this book 3 of the Republic. We saw that Plato continues the theme of the education of the guardians in book 3, seeking to preserve the guardians from harmful influences. We saw this idea of a sort of subset of rulers emerging from among the guardians, those with a philosophic nature are going to emerge as rulers. So that's going to be a sort of separate class from the guardians, and then the sort of rest of the society of craftspeople and artisans sort of below those classes. So we've seen the class structure of the Republic, of the ideal society. We've seen that start to emerge here. Music and gymnastic emerge as the key to education, and as we saw, that's because music softens the spirit, makes us less prone to sort of anger and aggression, and gymnastic toughens our gentle side, enabling us to resist when our sort of spiritedness goes to excess, or when desire goes to excess. By toughening up our powers of mind, gymnastic enables us to kind of resist those urges. And finally, we saw that a noble lie must be told to the citizens to encourage patriotism, solidarity, and social unity across different classes. And that's very sort of clearly seen as part of the founder myth of the ideal city. And so that sort of leaves us with a situation where we sort of encourage to think that these myths are necessary to the city, and we have to sort of question this idea and to think about why Plato believes this to be the case.